As you all might have realized by now, a lot of the things I talk about on Fascinating Fiction are either forms of media I grew up with, or the one I've come to love over the years. And despite this, one of my most popular videos to this day is a lackluster overview of the series I did only at the request of someone who I am no longer friends with. It has also led me to breaking my brain at least twice trying to understand everything within its continuity. So, normal YouTube stuff. The reason I bring this up is because I'm a bit of an older content creator when it comes to YouTube as far as age, meaning that I've been around for a lot of the cartoons, animes, and movies' first versions and showings. This means there's a lot of nostalgia that can influence my content, which is why I always try to rewatch everything I talk about so I can look at things with a critiquing mind. I'm wanting to evaluate something on its own merits rather than the memories of my childhood. So believe me when I say that talking about Ranma 1/2, an anime that I grew up with since the 90s, in 2025 because it has a new anime out is frankly what I've come to expect from media at this point. Even more so when its first season of the anime is an honest improvement from what I remember of the original. Hello everyone, I am your ever-friendly Pokeprof, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction. Ranma 1/2 is an interesting series for me to talk about because of how much of my own life has been influenced by it, as, believe it or not, this is a series that got me into anime and manga. While, like most 90s kids, Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, and Sailor Moon were the cornerstone of a lot of my early anime viewings, I didn't really understand what anime was back at that time. I just thought it was cartoons that looked a little different from what I was used to, and didn't really question it. It wasn't until I was getting into my later years of high school that I stumbled upon the first issues of Ranma 1/2 and started reading it. What started out as a curious interest in this colorful manga cover became one of my first real hyperfixations when it came to the anime world, thanks to a combination of wacky Japanese humor, martial arts, and being a bit more mature form of media thanks to the inclusion of things like the occasional topless female. Yeah, it's kind of a lowbrow thing to admit now, but remember, this was the 90s, where having blood in your title and giving your characters a bunch of guns was enough for it to be labeled mature. Either way, this was one of my early gateways into pretty much anything involving fandom, especially when it came to fan fiction, and if it weren't for this particular series' influence on my life, I would have absolutely no idea if I would know the friends I would have today, or even be in the same place in my life. And while I am one of the first people to point out the series' flaws, even to this day, I hold a soft spot for Ranma and his cast. But let's actually do a quick sum up of Ranma's history before delving a little bit into this newest anime, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Created back in 1987, Ranma 1/2 was the fourth manga series that Rumiko Takahashi created. Already well known for Urusei Yatsura, and I apologize if I butchered that, and the alien girl Lum, most people would actually become familiar with the series that Takahashi created after Ranma 1/2, about a particular demon dog by the name of Inuyasha. With the likes of Dragon Ball and Fist of the North Star already making waves within the world of battle manga, it's not surprising that anyone who was wanting to break into that same genre would need to give their own story a unique spin to catch the audience's attention. And Ranma is perhaps most well known for, especially back in this era of history, tossing a curveball at audiences that they never saw coming. You see, this was one half of the core defining aspects of the Ranma series established within the very first few chapters or episodes, depending on your source. As a wandering martial artist training under his father, Ranma is eventually dragged over to China, where they visit the cursed springs of Jizenkyo. Each spring has a tragic story about someone or something that fell into one of these pools and drowned. Thanks to the magic inherent here, a curse is placed upon anyone who falls into the water afterwards, transforming them into the victim of the pools. This results in Ranma becoming a female version of himself, the curse being activated whenever he's hit by cold water, while hot water reverses the effect. It's this aspect of a main character who can flip gender so easily that caught the attention of many a reader, and, especially since Takahashi was a known artist at this point, many jumped into the series once they got to the other major aspect common in most of her works: romance. You see, it wasn't enough for Ranma to have this magical transformation. Genma Saotome, Ranma's father, would also go and set up a deal between himself and Soen Tendo, his close friend and student of the same martial arts school. They agreed that in the future they would put together their kids into an arranged marriage, uniting the two martial arts schools into one and ensuring their future legacy. And it kinda just goes all downhill from there. For almost the next decade, Ranma, his fiancée Akane, and a constantly growing list of friends, enemies, and side characters would be going through insane adventures that would include martial arts being made into things that wouldn't, or in some cases shouldn't have them, the constant attempt to cure Ranma's transformations, and the transformations of other characters as they're introduced, and the ever-growing list of fiancés. Yes, plural, that Ranma ends up getting over the course of the series. That's the other half of this franchise, the sheer craziness of it all. Ranma's popularity is such that it got its own anime, technically two if you're counting the fact that that first season was a failure and they reworked the entire series, several movies, video games, and more. But after the 90s, its presence just kind of vanishes. Unlike a lot of other franchises, outside of fanfiction, artwork, and the occasional "I remember that" aspect from older fans like myself, Ranma was kinda left to retire, especially as Inuyasha kinda took over when it came to Takahashi's own series. That was until a new anime was announced back in the middle of 2024, wanting to give an updated take on the original story. And with it having recently finished airing its first season on Netflix, I thought we should talk about it a little bit, going into what sets it apart from the original anime and manga, and what challenges I feel like they've got for the future. What's perhaps the biggest thing that Ranma's anime has going for it is the fact that it's been very faithful to the original manga, something that's a bit of a big talking point when it comes to the whole kit and caboodle that is this genre of animation. While it was a lot more common back in the 90s when it came to older franchises, there is a long history of many anime adaptations either adding things into their shows that were never part of the original source material, or just flat out being different than how it was originally portrayed. Part of this comes from the fact that a number of these anime were being adapted as the original creator was still writing and drawing the manga. The people making the show had to wait for more material to be made before they could adapt it. Even with this in mind though, some anime just kinda did their own thing, regardless of the manga. Ranma's first anime is exceptionally guilty of this, especially later on in its life, so seeing a more accurate telling of these characters and their events is very much appreciated. But this show is also able to bring the focus in one element that always felt lacking, which is to say, the new anime does a better job than any other version of this series to sell the audience on Ranma's relationship and eventual romance to Akane. At her core, Rumiko Takahashi is a romance writer. Even when she's tried to focus on pure adventure or comedy, romance has always been her strongest suit, to the point that Lum, arguably one of her most famous characters, continued to come back in the manga she was in solely because of the romance and popularity of the character. Ranma's original manga does split the difference between humor and romance a bit better than most of her work, but it's still got romance at its core. The problem was, the original anime never seemed to have gotten that memo. Comedy was the focus of that anime, where a lot of the character flaws, events, and overall silliness of how things could get was cranked up to 11, in a series that was already well known for cranking things up that high as it was. Things that would only rarely happen in the manga would be a lot more common for the sake of a visual gag. But that brings us to the modern anime, and while comedy is still very much a factor, there's a far greater emphasis on the romance here than the original could ever hope to attain, and in some points it's even more so than what we see in the original manga. Part of this is simply pacing. Being so focused on comedy and having only a few panels to play with for both of the older versions of Ranma, any romantic moment was shot dead in the water because we had the jokes and the gags coming up right afterwards. In this newest series though, those romantic moments linger. We get a sense that this scene is more important to the overall development of the characters because we spend just that much more time on it before we deal with the craziness of whatever fight our characters are getting into next. I can say for certain that I feel like Ranma and Akane actually have chemistry here, and it's rather interesting considering how often the two of them are at each other's throats. Which leads us to the interesting aspect of looking towards the future as someone who knows this series like I do, and the potential twists and problems that loom before it, with its biggest being, well, the age of the series. Some of the characters' actions and choices, while played for laughs and jokes back in the 80s and 90s, aren't as looked at as fondly these days. And considering we've got a character coming up that makes Master Roshi from Dragon Ball Z look like a respectful saint of women, well, let's just say I'm really curious on how modern audiences are going to be taking a pervert of epic proportions here. And that's perhaps the thing that I'm the most worried about when it comes to this recent Ranma anime. How people of the year 2025 will take something that was originally designed for the 80s while seeing minimal differences. Despite how the series eventually became something that helped many fans learn and accept the idea of being trans, as this was many people's first exposure to a character who could physically be the opposite gender, the actual concept isn't ever really treated with any dignity or respect here. Ranma views his transformation as a curse, using it to his advantage only when the situation calls for it or he has no other choice. Hell, one of the major running phrases throughout the entire franchise is him being a man among men, with the entire phrase being used as a joke because he turns into a woman. Ranma is a series that has lived on mostly in fan works and fan fiction for the last few decades. And while people and authors within those spaces have grown, adapted, and changed with the progression of time, the original series hasn't. And I'm afraid that people will come to dislike the more recent series for having ideals that are, let's be entirely honest, outdated. Ranma is a series that I've honestly been wanting to talk about on the show for some time, but I honestly could never find the right moment. I've got a lot of my own feelings mixed up within the show and its counterparts. Some good, some bad, and some that makes me feel like I'm a Star Wars fan with how much I'm willing to nitpick the little elements here and there. And considering it's been over half a decade since I've properly given the original versions of this franchise a look through, I'm more than willing to admit that my old memories just might be blowing things out of proportion here. Regardless of all that, what we've seen from this first season has given me enough hope for the future that, while this anime will likely retain a lot of the zaniness and chaotic leanings that made the original so much fun to dive into, that they're willing to add a little bit more heart into the series. How this will go on to affect characters, relationships, and other things to come is anybody's guess, but while I've got my worries, I'm going to have hopes that things will be just fine. Because if there's one thing from this franchise that I know the best, Ranma Saotome doesn't lose. With all that said, I hope I've done a good job to entertain you, and I'll do my best to do so again in the future. Hopefully you'll follow along with my content by subscribing and doing all the other things that gives us YouTubers life. If you wish to support me a bit more, I do have a Patreon where you can get access to bonus content. But until next time, stay frosty.